Stop! Elena Vale's voice cut through the room like a blade. 12 of the most dangerous men in the American South turned simultaneously toward a waitress holding a coffee tray. Nobody moved. You've had 3 language experts, 2 historians, and a priest from the Vatican standing in this room for 2 hours. Her eyes locked onto the ancient parchment on the table. And every single one of them has been reading it completely wrong. The silence that followed was not the silence of disbelief. It was the silence that precedes a gun being drawn. And then, one by one, 12 hands reached toward 12 weapons. If you're new here, subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The rain had been falling for 4 hours straight. It hit the roof of the St. Verona Club, the way punishment falls on the guilty, relentless, indifferent, without mercy. The building sat on a quiet corner in the oldest part of New Orleans, the kind of street that didn't appear on tourist maps, the kind of address that wasn't spoken above a whisper in certain circles. From the outside, it looked like every other private dining establishment in the French Quarter. Dark wood, fogged windows, a single iron lamp burning above the entrance. From the inside, it was something else entirely. The upstairs chamber ran the full length of the building. Black marble floors, a long rectangular table that had been imported from somewhere in Sicily before the Second World War. 12 high-backed chairs all occupied, candles burning at each end. And at the center of the table, sealed inside a glass display case that had been cracked open less than 40 minutes ago, a piece of parchment so old it looked like it might dissolve if you breathed on it wrong. That parchment was the reason 12 of the most powerful men in the organized South were sitting in the same room on the same night, something that hadn't happened in over a decade. That parchment was also the reason 3 separate experts were currently standing against the far wall, sweating through their shirts, despite the cold, none of them willing to make eye contact with the man seated at the head of the table. Adrian Moretti had not moved in 11 minutes. He sat with both hands flat on the table, his father's ring on his right hand, the one that had been cut from Salvatore Moretti's finger at the hospital 6 hours ago, and pressed into Adrian's palm without ceremony or sentiment. The ring felt wrong, too heavy, too soon. Everything about tonight felt wrong. Salvatore Moretti had not expected to die on a Wednesday. He had not expected to die at 62, certainly not from a heart attack that came without warning while he was eating breakfast alone in his kitchen. He had not written a proper farewell. He had not prepared his son. He had not, in the 31 years he spent building the Moretti Empire into the most formidable criminal organization in the Gulf South, ever gotten around to explaining to Adrian exactly what the succession oath required. That oversight was now the most dangerous problem in the room. "Tell me again," Adrian said. His voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that made people pay attention. "Tell me again why none of you can read it." The first expert, a professor of classical languages from Tulane, who had been called at midnight and driven over in a panic, stepped forward and cleared his throat. "Mr. Moretti, the document is partially Latin, partially Old Sicilian dialect, and the remainder is something I've never encountered in academic literature. The symbols mixed throughout don't correspond to any standard linguistic notation system I've been trained in. I can translate fragments, but the fragments don't cohere into a single readable passage. Every section I manage to render sounds like a different document." Adrian looked at him for a long moment. "So you're telling me you flew from Europe for this?" "I drove from uptown, sir." "Even worse." The second expert, a priest in his 60s who had spent decades working with Vatican historical archives, pressed his hands together and spoke carefully. "The text has theological elements I recognize. Certain phrases echo early church ceremony oath-binding rituals from the medieval period. But whoever wrote this document appears to have deliberately obscured the language, as though the reading itself was meant to be restricted, as though not everyone was supposed to be able to perform it." "That's very interesting," Adrian said. "That's also completely useless to me right now." The third expert said nothing. She hadn't said anything in 20 minutes. She was a linguist who had been brought from Baton Rouge, and at some point in the last half hour, She had decided that speaking further would only make things worse. She stood very still and stared at a fixed point on the wall. Don Marco Bellucci, seated to Adrian's left, leaned forward and folded his hands on the table. He was 71 years old, with white hair cut close to his skull and eyes that had seen enough violence to stop being disturbed by it. He had served Salvatore Moretti for 32 years. He had been by every external measure the most loyal man in the organization. He had also been one of the first to arrive tonight, and one of the most vocal about the urgency of completing the ceremony before dawn. "Adrian," he said, his voice carrying the particular gravity of a man accustomed to being listened to. "The oath must be performed tonight. Your father was clear about this. If the succession is not formalized before the sun rises, the covenant is considered void. And if the covenant is void—" "I know what happens if the covenant is void," Adrian said. "Then perhaps we proceed without the full text. Perhaps a partial reading is sufficient." One of the other capos, a heavy-set man named Vitelli, who ran operations along the Mississippi River corridor, shifted in his chair. "A partial oath is not an oath. That's always been the position. You break the tradition, you break the foundation. You break the foundation, everything built on top of it becomes negotiable. Everything is already negotiable," said another voice across the table. A younger capo named Declan Ferris, who had married into the Moretti network through an alliance with an Irish family out of Savannah. "The old man has been dead for 6 hours. You think the Castillo organization doesn't already know that? You think they're sitting around waiting politely while we sort out paperwork?" "This is not paperwork," Bellucci said sharply. "This is the covenant. This is what separates what we are from what they are." "What we are," Ferris said, "is currently without a confirmed head. Which means what we are is vulnerable. Which means every conversation we're having right now is a gift to our enemies." The room bristled. Two of the capos exchanged looks. A bodyguard near the door adjusted his stance. The tension in that room had been building for the better part of 2 hours, and it had the specific quality of something that was approaching a breaking point. Not the theatrical tension of men performing danger for each other. The real kind. The kind that had been known to end with bodies. Adrian pressed his palms flat on the table and stood. The room went quiet instantly. That was the thing about Adrian Moretti that nobody had quite predicted. He was 34 years old. He had never run an operation. He had never ordered a hit. Never negotiated a territory dispute. Never sat at a table like this one, with anything resembling authority. He had spent the last several years running the legitimate real estate arm of the Moretti Holdings, keeping the financial structures clean, staying out of the parts of the business that required getting blood on your hands. And yet when he stood, the room responded. Something in his posture. Something in his silence. Something that said, "I am not afraid of any of you," which was either very true or a very convincing performance. And in rooms like this one, the difference didn't always matter. "I'm going to say something," Adrian said, "and I want it heard clearly by everyone in this room." He looked around the table. Each face in turn. 12 men, each one representing a piece of a machine his father had spent his life building. "My father built this organization on one principle above everything else, that the men inside it were worth more than the men outside it. That loyalty had a value. That the covenant wasn't a formality, it was a living agreement between people who had decided to trust each other with their lives." He let that settle. "If we can't perform the oath tonight, we will find another way to honor what it means. But I am not going to sit here while experts argue and capos threaten each other and let this organization fracture because we're too proud to admit we're stuck." He looked at the parchment. Somebody has to know what this says. Somebody always knows. We find that person, tonight, whatever it takes. The room absorbed this. A few of the capos nodded slowly. Vitelli looked skeptical, but said nothing. Bellucci's expression didn't change, which Adrian had already noticed was the most concerning reaction of all. That was the first time Adrian noticed it. Bellucci's total stillness. Not the stillness of a man at ease, the stillness of a man waiting. He filed it away and moved on. The experts were dismissed. One of Adrian's lieutenants, a steady man named Caruso, who had been with the family since before Adrian was born, took the dismissed scholars out through a side door with the careful efficiency of someone who understood that discretion was part of the job. The capos broke into smaller conversations. Some argued, some smoked. Ferris stood at the window looking down at the rain-soaked street below. Bellucci remained at the table turning something over in his fingers. A cufflink or a small coin, it was hard to tell. His eyes tracked the room with the methodical patience of a man cataloging exits. Adrian took the parchment from its case and studied it alone at the end of the table. He was not a linguist. He was not a historian. He had no more ability to decode the document than the three professionals who had just been escorted out. But he read it anyway, running his eyes across the strange symbols and the half-familiar Latin constructions, the way you read something in a foreign language you barely know, hoping that proximity to the words might produce some understanding that technical knowledge alone couldn't reach. It didn't work. But it was while he was leaning over the parchment, absorbed and frustrated, that he became aware of a sound that shouldn't have registered. A quiet voice, almost inaudible beneath the ambient noise of rain and conversation, coming from the direction of the doorway. He looked up. She was standing just inside the threshold. A woman. Dark hair pulled back simply. A plain black uniform. The kind worn by the service staff at St. Verona. She was holding a coffee service on a small tray, and she was looking at the parchment with an expression that Adrian had never seen on anyone's face before when they looked at that document. Not confusion. Not curiosity. Not the performative concentration of someone trying to appear knowledgeable. Recognition. He stared at her. "What did you say?" She seemed to realize almost at the same moment that she had spoken out loud. The room had gone quiet again. Adrian wasn't sure precisely when that happened, but it had, and now every capo at the table and every bodyguard along the walls was looking at the waitress standing in the doorway holding a coffee tray. "I said..." She stopped, reconsidered. Something moved behind her eyes that Adrian couldn't name, a kind of internal calculation. Then, "I said you're reading it completely wrong." Someone laughed. A short, dismissive sound. Vitelli from across the table. "Did she just..." "Yes," Adrian said. He did not look away from her. "She did. 3 language experts from 3 universities can't make sense of it," said one of the other capos. A man named Greco, who ran distribution in the Bayou parishes and had a reputation for cruelty that he wore like a point of pride. "And the waitress has an opinion." "I'm not offering an opinion," she said. And here was the thing that made Adrian's attention sharpen the way it did. She wasn't performing calm. She actually was calm. Standing in a room full of men who collectively represented decades of violence and consequence, with every set of eyes trained on her, including several that belonged to men with weapons within easy reach, she stood with the particular steadiness of someone who had been in worse situations and survived them. "I'm telling you what I see." "And what?" Adrian said quietly. "Do you see?" She set the coffee tray down on a small table near the doorway. Slowly, no sudden movements. She understood the room she was in. Then she walked toward the parchment with a measured pace that suggested she wasn't oblivious to the risk she was taking. She was choosing to take it. She stopped at the edge of the table, 3 feet from the document. She didn't touch it. She looked at it the way someone looks at a piece of music before they perform it. "The symbols aren't letters," she said. "You've been trying to transliterate them, assign phonetic values. That's why no one can make it cohere. They're not part of a written language. They're performance notation." The room was very still. "They indicate breath pauses," she continued. "Tonal shifts, points of emphasis in oral delivery. This document was never meant to be read the way you'd read a legal contract. It was meant to be performed. The words carry meaning, but the meaning is only fully activated by the way they're spoken. The rhythm, the weight placed on certain syllables, the length of the pauses between phrases. Remove those elements, and you're left with fragments that don't connect, because they were never designed to connect on paper. They were designed to connect in sound." Nobody spoke. Adrian looked at the parchment and then back at her, and something shifted in him. A specific kind of shift that happens when a person who has been working a problem in completely the wrong direction suddenly understands why nothing has been working. It felt less like relief and more like vertigo. "How do you know this?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "My name is Elena Vale," she said. "I've been working here for 3 weeks." That's not an answer. She met his eyes, held them. "No, it isn't." Bellucci stood from his chair. He did it slowly, the way powerful men move when they want to remind a room that they're powerful. "This is a waste of time. Adrian the woman is a service employee who overheard a conversation and wandered into something she doesn't understand. We have a ceremony to perform. She might be the only person in this building who understands it," Adrian said, still watching Elena. "Which makes her the most important person here right now." Bellucci's jaw tightened, just slightly. Adrian caught it. "You can translate it," Adrian said to Elena. "You can tell me how it's supposed to be spoken." "I can tell you what the notation means," she said. "I can teach you how to read the rhythm. Whether you can perform it correctly is a different question. How long would it take to teach me?" She looked at the parchment again, then at him. "An hour. Maybe less if you're a fast learner." "We don't have an hour," Bellucci said. "We have until midnight," Adrian said. "That's 90 minutes. He looked at Elena. "Stay, Adrian." Bellucci's voice had a different edge now. Not anger exactly. Something more controlled than anger and therefore more concerning. "You're proposing to base the legitimacy of the entire succession covenant on information provided by a woman who has worked here for 3 weeks and cannot prove her qualifications. I'm proposing," Adrian said, "that we try everything available before we give up, which is what my father would have done." He looked at Bellucci with the kind of directness that left no room for interpretation. "Unless you have a better option." Bellucci looked at him for a long moment, then sat back down. Elena studied the parchment for the next 20 minutes, while Adrian watched, and the capos argued in low voices at the far end of the table. She traced the symbols with her eyes. Her lips moved slightly sub-vocalized, the way musicians sometimes read a score before they hear it played. She turned the display case to see the edges of the document. She closed her eyes for almost a full minute, and was so still that one of the bodyguards across the room shifted his weight and glanced toward Adrian. Adrian held up one hand slightly. "Not yet." When Elena opened her eyes, she said, "There are 7 sections. Each one is built around a core statement that the speaker delivers at full voice. The notation marks build toward those statements. The pauses before each one are as important as the words themselves. They're meant to create silence that the room absorbs. The oath isn't just a recitation, it's an event. The people in the room are part of it." "What does it say?" Adrian asked. "The core statements, in plain language. The first declares lineage, that the person speaking can trace their blood and their loyalty to the original covenant." She paused. "The second declares the cost. What the speaker has given, sacrificed, surrendered to hold this position. The third declares the boundary. What the speaker will not do, regardless of pressure or gain. The fourth declares the enemy, not by name, but by nature." Another pause. "The fifth is the one that's different from the others." "Different how?" "The other 4 are declarations," she said. "The fifth is a warning, and it's addressed to the room." Declan Ferris had drifted closer during this exchange. He was not a man given to obvious expressions of interest, but he was listening now with the kind of attention that bypassed his usual posture of detachment. "What is it warn about?" Elena looked at the document for a moment before she answered. "That the greatest threat to the covenant is never external. It's always internal. The oath says in the section I can read most clearly, 'The man who sits at your right hand and smiles when you speak is the one who will reach for your throat when you turn away.'" The room was quiet. Elena had not looked at Bellucci when she said it, but Adrian had watched Bellucci's hands when she spoke those words. He had been holding the small object, the cufflink or coin, turning it between his fingers. When Elena finished the sentence, his fingers went still. It was a small thing. A person watching from across the room might not have seen it, but Adrian was close, and Adrian noticed. "All right," he said. His voice was completely level. "Let's begin." They worked for the next hour at the end of the table, Adrian and Elena, and the ancient document between them. She would indicate a passage, explain the rhythm, demonstrate the breath. He would repeat it. She would correct him. He would repeat it again. It was nothing like what Adrian had expected the preparation for a Mafia succession ceremony to look like. It felt like rehearsing for a performance that mattered in some way he didn't yet fully understand. At one point, 40 minutes into the session, Elena said quietly, too low for anyone else to hear, "You're going to feel something during the 5th section. Everyone in the room is. That's how it was designed. Pay attention to who reacts and how." Adrian looked at her. "You've seen this performed before." She didn't answer, which was itself an answer. "Elena," he said, same quiet register. "I need to understand what I'm walking into." "You're walking into a ceremony that was designed to do two things," she said. "Confirm a leader, and expose whoever in the room shouldn't be trusted." Adrian absorbed this. "And you know that because—" She met his eyes steadily. "I know that because I've spent a very long time studying organizations like this one." He wanted to press further. He didn't. Not yet. What he knew and what settled into his chest with the weight of a stone was this. Elena Vale was not a waitress who had stumbled into something by accident. She was not a curious civilian who happened to understand a 300-year-old ceremonial document. She was something else entirely. And she had been in this building for 3 weeks, and she had spent those weeks waiting for exactly this night. The question he couldn't answer yet was waiting for what purpose. But midnight was coming, and there was no time for the answer. Bellucci approached at 11:45. He came to where Adrian was standing, and he did it when Elena had stepped away to refill the coffee service, as though he had timed it deliberately. "Adrian," he said, his voice carrying the particular blend of authority and affection that a much older man uses when he is trying to steer a younger one without appearing to steer. "I want to speak to you honestly, as someone who loved your father." "I know you did." "Then hear me. This woman concerns me. I don't know who she is. I don't know how she knows what she claims to know. What I know is that your father trusted his inner circle above all else, and his inner circle is in this room. Whatever she is offering you tonight, the wisdom of 30 years in this organization, tells me it comes at a price we haven't been shown yet." Adrian looked at him for a moment. "I appreciate you telling me. Your father would not have brought a stranger into the covenant ceremony?" "My father," Adrian said, and his voice was still quiet, still steady, "also didn't plan for tonight, so we're all doing things he didn't plan for." He looked toward Elena, who had returned to the doorway and was watching them from a careful distance. "Go back to the table, Don Bellucci. We begin in 15 minutes. Bellucci held his gaze for just a second longer than was necessary, then nodded and turned away. When he was gone, Elena came to stand beside Adrian. She didn't say, "What are you thinking?" or "What did he want?" She said, "When the 5th section begins, don't stop. No matter what happens in the room, don't stop speaking. The entire covenant depends on the 5th section being completed." Adrian looked at her. "You think something's going to happen." "Something always happens," she said. "That's what the warning was put there for." The candles at both ends of the table were burning low. 12 men around the black marble table. One ancient parchment. One man who had learned in a single hour what scholars had failed to decipher in a night. And one woman standing at the edge of the room, her dark eyes steady, her scarred hands quiet at her sides. Adrian picked up the parchment, held it, felt the weight of it, which was not physical weight, but something else, something accumulated. "Let's begin," he said. And the oath began to breathe. The first word Adrian spoke landed differently than anyone expected. It wasn't loud. It wasn't commanding in the theatrical way that men in rooms like this one usually performed authority. It was something quieter and somehow more unsettling than volume. It was weight. The word came out of him with a specific gravity, shaped by the breathing marks Elena had spent an hour walking him through, and the moment it left his mouth, the conversations at the far end of the table stopped mid-sentence. Vitelli looked up. Ferris turned from the window. Even the bodyguards along the walls, men trained to project stillness, as a professional discipline shifted almost imperceptibly toward the sound. Adrian didn't acknowledge any of it. He kept his eyes on the parchment, and his breath on the rhythm Elena had taught him, and he moved into the first section of the oath. The way someone moves into cold water, committed no hesitation, because hesitation only makes it worse. Elena stood near the wall where she had placed herself when the ceremony began. Her arms were at her sides. Her face was quiet. But her eyes were not quiet. Her eyes were moving continuously across the room, cataloging reactions the way a trained observer catalogs a scene, and what she was reading was not the oath. She was reading the men listening to it. Capo Greco, who had made the dismissive comment about her earlier, was leaning slightly forward now with an expression he almost certainly didn't know he was wearing. Something between skepticism and the early stages of something he didn't have language for yet. Ferris had his arms crossed, which was his default posture, but his shoulders had dropped. A small thing. The particular kind of physical release that happens when a body responds to something before the mind catches up. Vitelli was completely still, which was unusual for a man who had been shifting and fidgeting for the better part of 2 hours. And Bellucci. Elena had been watching Bellucci since the moment she walked into this room. She had been watching him before that, in the 3 weeks she had spent carrying trays and refilling glasses, and making herself invisible in every room this building contained. She knew his patterns. She knew the way he held his body when he was comfortable, and the way it changed when he wasn't. She knew the way he looked at Adrian when Adrian wasn't looking back, the particular calculation in it, the way a chess player looks at a board and identifies the piece that needs to be removed. When the first section of the oath ended and the prescribed silence that Elena had explained to Adrian fell over the room, Bellucci's hands tightened on the edge of the table, not dramatically. Not in a way that would have announced itself to a casual observer. But Elena's observation was not casual. His knuckles went fractionally pale against the dark marble. A grip tightening against something, or against the impulse to do something. She filed it. She said nothing. Adrian moved into the second section. This one was different in rhythm. Slower at the beginning, building toward a point of emphasis in the middle, the way a wave builds before it breaks. The notation Elena had decoded indicated a full-breath pause before the central phrase long enough to be conspicuous, long enough to make the room feel the silence as a weight. Adrian had practiced it. He hit it correctly, and the silence fell. And what happened in that silence was something Elena had described to him theoretically, but that landed differently when it was real. 12 men in a room held their breath without deciding to. The third section was the declaration of boundaries. What the oath-taker would not do. And here, something happened that Elena had not specifically anticipated, not in this form. Adrian didn't just deliver the notation correctly. He delivered it with something underneath it, something personal, some layer of meaning that came from being 34 years old and standing in his dead father's place after 6 hours of grief that he hadn't been given time to feel. The words about what a leader refuses to sacrifice, they came out of him differently than they had in rehearsal. They came out with something true in them. 3 of the capos looked at each other. It was a quick exchange. The kind of look that passes between people when they witness something unexpected and need to confirm that the other person saw it too. Elena watched it happen and felt something she hadn't planned to feel. She set it aside and kept watching. It was during the 4th section, the declaration of the enemy, that the first crack appeared. Adrian was halfway through the passage when Bellucci made a sound. Not a word, not an interruption. Just a sound at the back of his throat, the kind of involuntary vocalization a person produces when they're suppressing a stronger reaction. It was quiet enough that most of the room didn't catch it. Adrian, who was looking at the parchment, didn't catch it. Elena caught it. She looked at Bellucci directly for the first time since the ceremony had begun. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Adrian with an expression that had dropped most of its careful management. For just a second, perhaps 2, Elena could see past the elder statesman, past the trusted advisor, past the man who had stood at Salvatore Moretti's side for 32 years and been described in every account she had read as the most loyal figure in the organization. What she saw underneath it was not loyalty. She had seen that particular expression before. In other rooms, in other cities, on other men who had spent long careers building something they controlled, and who had arrived at the moment when control was about to transfer and discovered they were not prepared to let it go. The fourth section ended, the prescribed silence held. And then Adrian lifted his eyes from the parchment and looked at the room for the first time since he had begun. He found Elena first. A single look, a quick assessment. She gave him the smallest nod she could make. He turned back to the parchment and drew the specific breath that the notation indicated before the fifth section. And everything changed, because the fifth section was different. Elena had told him that. She had told him it was a warning addressed to the room rather than a declaration made by the speaker. What she hadn't told him, because she hadn't wanted to introduce uncertainty before a performance that required confidence, was that the fifth section had a particular effect on people who had something to hide. She had read about it. She had studied the documented accounts of the few succession ceremonies that had ever been observed and recorded documents that existed in a very small archive that very few people had ever accessed. The accounts described it consistently. The fifth section performed correctly, with the full weight of the notational rhythm intact, created something in the air of the room that could not be precisely explained, but was also impossible to ignore. Something that made pretense expensive. Something that stripped a layer off of the performance of composure. Adrian's voice shifted when he reached the fifth section. Not because he was trying to shift it, because the notation required it. The rhythm changed slower now with more space between phrases, each silence longer and more deliberate than the one before. And the content of what he was saying, the warning about the man who smiles and reaches the language about trust that conceals intention. It settled into the room with the quality of something that was not just being heard, but being felt. Elena kept her eyes on Bellucci. He lasted through the first half of the fifth section, 40 seconds, maybe 45. Then his right hand moved. It moved toward the inside of his jacket. Not fast, not in the explosive motion of someone who has decided on violence. Slower than that, and somehow more frightening for the slowness. The motion of a man who had made a decision at some earlier point and was only now beginning to execute it. The motion of someone following a plan. Elena did not hesitate. She crossed the distance between herself and the marble table in 4 steps and hit the near edge of the table with both hands and drove it sideways with everything she had. The table moved. Black marble that weighed several hundred pounds, that had stood in this room for decades, that no sane person would have attempted to move alone, shifted on its base with a grinding sound that cut through the room like a siren. Candles toppled. The display case slid and struck the floor. And in the half second before chaos took over, Elena shouted, "Down, now!" The gun appeared from inside Bellucci's jacket. It fired once before 2 of the nearest bodyguards tackled him from both sides. The shot went into the ceiling. Plaster dust. A sound like the room itself cracking, and then everything that had been held in suspension for hours came apart simultaneously. Men were shouting. Chairs overturned. 2 of the capos went to the floor, automatically old instincts of survival overriding everything else. Vitelli, whose size would have made diving under a table difficult, backed himself into a corner with both hands raised, which, given the circumstances, was possibly the most sensible thing anyone in the room did. Ferris hit the light switch on the wall beside him, plunging the room into near darkness, illuminated only by the candles on the floor and the ambient light from the rain-blurred windows. He had done it without being asked. Fast, reflexive thinking. Elena noted it. Adrian was behind the toppled table. He had gone down when Elena shouted without question, without the half-second of ego-driven hesitation that would have gotten him killed. He had trusted her instruction with the same completeness he had trusted it during rehearsal, and because of that, he was alive. Bellucci was on the floor. 2 bodyguards held him by the arms. A third had kicked the gun across the room where it came to rest against the baseboard, irrelevant now. The room was breathing hard. Elena stood at the center of it, perfectly still, her own breathing even. Controlled. The stillness of someone whose nervous system had been trained for exactly this kind of moment. Capo Greco was the first to speak. He stood up from behind an overturned chair, a cut on his palm from broken glass, and looked at Elena with an expression that had moved a very long way from the dismissiveness he'd worn 2 hours ago. "Who," he said slowly, "are you?" "That's a longer conversation," Elena said. "Then let's have it." "After," she said. She looked across the room at Adrian, who was standing now, his father's ring catching what light remained. His face carrying the specific expression of a man who has just experienced something that has rearranged his understanding of the evening. The 5th section wasn't finished. The room stared at her. "The oath requires completion," she said. "The covenant isn't established until the 5th section closes. Everything that happened just now, the betrayal, it's part of what the 5th section was designed to reveal. But it still has to be completed." Adrian looked at the parchment which had fallen to the floor, and was intact, the glass case having protected it even in the fall. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he reached down and picked it up. "Adrian," Vitelli said. The man's voice had changed. The skepticism that had lived in it all night was gone. What replaced it was something raw and less defended. "What she said earlier, about the threat from inside. You knew." "I suspected," Adrian said. He looked at Elena. She suspected more specifically. "She's a waitress," Greco said, but the word didn't carry the weight it had before. It landed more like a question than a statement. "She was never a waitress," Ferris said quietly from across the room. He had been watching Elena since the moment she moved the table. "You can see it in how she stands. You can see it in how she moved when she crossed the room. That's not someone who carries coffee for a living." Elena met Ferris's eyes. He was sharper than she had estimated. That was worth noting. Bellucci, still pinned on the floor, made a sound. Not the particular sound of a man in physical pain, though that was likely present too, but the sound of a man watching something he had worked toward for a very long time collapse under the weight of its own failure. A sound that was underneath all its anger and shock, essentially grief. "It was going to be chaos anyway," he said. His voice was remarkably steady given his position. "The boy doesn't know what he's doing. He never did. Salvatore spent 30 years building a machine and then handed it to someone who wanted to turn it into a charity." "Don Bellucci," Adrian said. He stood over the older man now, not with cruelty, but with the specific weight of someone who has just been confirmed in a suspicion he didn't want to have. "Were you planning this tonight, or before my father died?" Bellucci said nothing. "Before," Elena answered for him, not with triumph in her voice, with the flat accuracy of someone stating a documented fact. He had communication with 2 of the Castillo organization's upper tier going back at least 14 months. He positioned himself as the transition bridge. The deal was he removes you before the oath installs someone manageable, and in exchange the Castillo organization agrees to a territorial arrangement that advantages everyone at the table except the Moretti bloodline. The room was as quiet as it had been at any point in the night. 14 months, Ferris said. "At minimum," Elena said. "How do you know that?" Vitelli said. Elena looked at him. "Because I've been reading his communications for 8 of those 14 months. That landed the way she knew it would. The room absorbed it. You could watch the recalibration happening in real time on each face, the adjustment from one understanding of the evening to another. Elena had lived long enough and done this work long enough to know what that recalibration felt like to the people experiencing it. The ground moving. The certainty they'd walked in with, revealed to be a surface laid over something completely different. Greco sat down heavily in the chair behind him. "She's intelligence," he said. "Not to anyone specifically, to the room." "I didn't say that," Elena said. "You didn't have to." He looked at her with the blunt assessment of a man who had spent his adult life reading people in circumstances that made accuracy a survival requirement. "So this whole night, The oath. You being here. None of it was an accident. The oath being untranslatable was an accident, Elena said. That part surprised me too. She paused. Everything else was planned. Adrian had been listening to this exchange from where he stood holding the parchment. Something was working behind his eyes, some internal process that the people who knew him would have recognized as the particular quality of attention he brought to problems that required looking at all the pieces from a different angle before the shape of them became clear. You were going to let us fail, he said to Elena. Not an accusation, a realization. You came here tonight with a different plan, and something changed. Elena looked at him. In the months she had spent building her understanding of the Moretti organization, studying its structure and its people and its history, she had developed a picture of Adrian Moretti that was largely built from external data. Financial records, public filings, accounts from people who knew him. The picture had been of someone different from his father, someone who wanted a different kind of organization, someone who was not built for what the organization required. She had not factored in the way he performed the fifth section of the oath. She had not factored in the particular quality of honesty in his voice when he delivered the declaration of boundaries, the thing about what a leader refuses to sacrifice. She had spent years in rooms with powerful men, and she could recognize in the way a person who has handled counterfeit currency for long enough can recognize the real thing by touch when someone's performance of integrity was authentic and when it was craft. Adrian's was authentic. That was the problem. That was what had changed. Something changed, she said. That was all she gave him, for now. He held her gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he looked back at the parchment. We finished the oath. Nobody argued. Bellucci was moved to a chair against the wall, restrained two bodyguards flanking him. He did not protest and did not speak. He sat with the stillness of a man who has exhausted his options and is waiting to see what comes next. There was something almost dignified about it, which made it more disturbing, not less. Adrian found his place in the fifth section and resumed from the point where the interruption had occurred. The room settled. Not into the charged tension of before, but into something different. Something heavier and more aware of itself. These 12 men, or 11 now, had come here tonight expecting ceremony. What they had gotten was the ceremony, and everything the ceremony was designed to reveal, and the weight of that was on all of them. When Adrian finished the fifth section, the last notation indicated the longest silence of the entire document. Longer than felt comfortable. Long enough that two of the capos exchanged uncertain looks. Long enough that the rain against the windows was the only sound in the room. Then Adrian spoke the closing phrase of the seventh and final section. He didn't need the parchment for it. He had memorized it during rehearsal without trying to the way certain phrases embed themselves simply because of the intention carried inside them. The oath was complete. Elena stood at the edge of the room and watched the 11 men around the table absorb what had just happened. The ceremony was real. They all understood that. Whatever skepticism some of them had carried in about the validity of a succession performed under these circumstances, under emergency conditions, with an improvised translator, and a betrayal attempted midway through the experience of having been in the room for. It had done something to that skepticism. Vitelli spoke first, quietly, almost to himself. He's the boss. No one disputed it. Elena looked at Adrian. He had set the parchment down on a surface and was standing with his hands at his sides, and he was looking across the room at Bellucci, and what Elena saw on his face was not satisfaction, and not triumph, and not the cold relief of a man who has outmaneuvered a threat. What she saw was grief. The real kind. Not for the betrayal, though, that was there too, but for something older. For a man who had been his father's most trusted figure for 32 years, and had turned out to be something else entirely, and for what that meant about all the stories Adrian had grown up being told about loyalty and blood and the people who could be counted on. He was 34 years old, and his father had been buried for 6 hours, and the world he had inherited was already proving to be completely different from the world he'd been told it was. Elena had seen a lot of men absorb that particular discovery. She had never seen one absorb it this quietly. Caruso, the lieutenant, who had been with the family since before Adrian was born, came and stood beside him. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, which Elena recognized as exactly the right instinct. Ferris walked to where Elena stood at the edge of the room. He stopped beside her and looked out at the same scene she was looking at. "Are you going to tell him the rest?" he said. His voice was low, not conspiratorial, just private. "What rest?" Elena said, though she knew what he meant. "Whatever the real reason is that you've been here for 3 weeks," Ferris said. "Whatever you came here to do before tonight changed things." He glanced at her sideways. "Because something changed things. And I'd like to know what." Elena looked at him. Declan Ferris had been an afterthought in her intelligence on the organization. An outsider who had married in someone whose loyalties had always been considered contingent. She was revising that assessment in real time. "That conversation," she said, "is going to happen, just not tonight." Ferris nodded slowly. "Fair enough." He looked back at Adrian. "He's going to have questions too." "I know. He's going to want answers." "He's going to get them," she said, "when I decide what the answers are." Ferris looked at her for a moment. Then something almost like respect moved across his face, the reluctant kind that forms when someone proves to be more than you assumed. He walked away without another word. Across the room, Adrian had turned from looking at Bellucci and was looking at Elena. The distance between them was 30 feet, and the wreckage of an evening that had become something no one in this building could have predicted 6 hours ago. The overturned table, the fallen candles, the parchment that had held a secret for 300 years and had finally given it up. He looked at her the way someone looks at a door they need to open when they're not certain what's on the other side. Elena looked back. And for the first time in 3 weeks, she was not certain what came next. That uncertainty had a feeling she hadn't expected. It felt like the beginning of something. And that was the most dangerous thing she had encountered all night. Nobody slept. That was the simple fact of the hour after the oath. The room that had been a ceremony chamber was now something harder to name, part crime scene, part courtroom, part confessional. And the 11 men moving through it were doing so with the careful energy of people who understood that the ground they were standing on had fundamentally shifted and were not yet sure of their footing on the new terrain. Caruso had organized it efficiently, the way he organized most things, without announcement and without drama. Bellucci was in a chair against the wall with his wrists zip-tied and 2 men watching him who had no personal affection for him and who understood their instructions without being given them explicitly. 2 other bodyguards were dealing with the physical aftermath, the overturned table, the shattered glass, the general evidence of what had almost happened. The capos had redistributed themselves around the room in the small clusters that form naturally when a group of powerful people is processing something collectively that none of them wants to process alone. Adrian was at the window. He had been there for 12 minutes. Elena knew, because she had been watching the clock on the wall, the way she watched all things in a room she was uncertain about continuously without making it obvious. He stood with one hand braced against the frame and looked down at the rain-covered street below, and he did not move, and he did not speak. And the men in the room gave him that space, with the instinctive deference of people who understood that the head of an organization needs moments that belong only to him. Elena stood near the doorway. She had not left. She had considered it in the immediate aftermath of the gunshot and the chaos and the oath's completion, considered simply walking out the way she had walked in carrying the exit she had always maintained as an option. 3 weeks of preparation included 3 weeks of knowing exactly where every door in this building was and which ones were monitored and which ones weren't. She had not taken any of them. She was still examining why. Ferris came to stand near her, not beside her, about 4 feet away, which was close enough to talk without being overheard, but distant enough to avoid the appearance of a private conference. She was continuing to discover a man who paid attention to appearances with a sophistication that most people in this room lacked. The 2 men Bellucci had communication with in the Castillo organization. Ferris said, his voice low and conversational. "Are they expecting to hear from him tonight?" Elena looked at him. "Probably. So when they don't, they'll know something went wrong." "That's a reasonable assumption." "Which means we have a window," Ferris said. Before they recalibrate. Before they make decisions based on whatever conclusion they reach about why Bellucci went quiet. How long a window? Elena said. Depends on their protocols. If they're careful, 48 hours before they move. If they're not, less. He looked across the room at Adrian's back. He needs to know this. He does, Elena agreed. He also needs the next 10 minutes to be what they are. Ferris considered this, nodded once, stayed where he was. What Adrian was doing at that window, Elena understood without being told, was not looking at the street. He was having a conversation with his father. The private interior kind that the grieving have with the dead when the circumstances don't permit anything more formal. 6 hours after a burial, and he had already confirmed as head of an organization his father had spent 30 years building, survived an assassination attempt that had been 14 months in the making, and discovered that the man his father trusted most had been working against everything his father had built. There was no protocol for processing that volume of experience in that compressed a time frame. You stood at a window, and you looked at the rain, and you did the best you could. Vitelli approached Caruso near the far wall, and the two men spoke in low tones. Elena caught fragments. Something about the parishes. Something about communication going out before morning. The organization's machinery beginning to move again, reorganizing itself around the new center of gravity. That was how these things worked. The personal and the operational ran in parallel, never waiting for each other. Greco came to Elena directly. He didn't approach with aggression and didn't approach with warmth. He approached with the specific bluntness of a man who had decided that the fastest route to the information he needed was the direct one. I need to understand something, he said. Ask it, Elena said. You had intelligence on Bellucci going back 8 months. You knew he was moving against the Moretti succession. You were in this building for 3 weeks, which means you were here before Salvatore died. He stopped. Let that sit. So you either knew Salvatore was going to die, which suggests something I don't want to think about, or you were already positioned here for a different reason, and his death changed your plans. It was an intelligent construction. Elena had underestimated Greco the same way she had underestimated Ferris, which told her something useful about her own assumptions going into this operation. The second one, she said. What was the original reason? That I'm not going to tell you tonight. Greco's jaw tightened. He was a man accustomed to getting answers. You saved his life tonight. That earns you something. It doesn't earn you everything. I know, Elena said. I'm not asking for everything. I'm asking for tonight to be what it is. There's time for the rest. He studied her for a moment. What he was trying to determine, she could see it clearly, was whether she was a threat or an asset. Because in the world he lived in, those were the two categories that mattered, and everything else was a subcategory of one or the other. He hadn't reached a conclusion yet. That was fine. She didn't need him to reach one tonight. He moved away without giving her a verdict, which meant she hadn't lost him. In a room like this one, not losing someone was often as much as you could ask for. Adrian turned from the window. He looked at the room first. The scan of a man taking inventory of what he had. Then his eyes found Elena, and he crossed toward her, with the particular directness of someone who has finished the interior conversation and is ready for the exterior one. He stopped 2 feet from her. Close enough that what he said next wouldn't carry. I need to understand who you are, he said. Not a story, not a careful version. I need the actual thing. Not here, Elena said. Then where? She glanced at the room. At the 11 men and the bodyguards and Bellucci sitting against the wall with his eyes closed and his wrists bound. Is there somewhere in this building that isn't this room? Adrian looked at Caruso, who had been watching this exchange with the alert attention of someone whose job is to anticipate what his principal needs before he asks for it. A look passed between them. Caruso tilted his head slightly toward the hallway. 5 minutes, Adrian said to the room. Not a question. Nobody argued with it. The hallway outside the chamber was narrow and dark, lit by a single fixture, and it smelled like old wood and the particular institutional cleaner used in buildings that had been maintained by the same staff for decades. Adrian and Elena stood at opposite ends of a short stretch of corridor, and the door at the far end was closed, and the door behind them was closed. And for the first time since Elena had entered the ceremony chamber, she was alone with the man whose life she had come here to complicate. "Start wherever you need to," Adrian said. Elena looked at him. 34 years old, his father's ring on his hand. Whatever grief he was carrying pressed down somewhere beneath the composure he was maintaining, because the people in the room behind them needed the composure, not the grief. She had a practiced ability to remain uninvested in the subjects of her work. She had refined it over years because investment was operationally dangerous. You saw what you needed to see when you were detached. You missed things when you cared. She was aware that she currently cared about what happened to this man. She was cataloging that awareness the way you catalog a structural problem in a building you're standing inside. It needed attention. Just not right now. "My name is actually Elena Vale," she said. That part was true. "I work for a covert international task force that operates outside national intelligence structures. We track and dismantle criminal networks that have significant political penetration. Judges, senators, state officials, people with legitimate power who are also inside criminal infrastructure." Adrian was watching her without expression. "And the Moretti organization has been on our monitoring list for 4 years. Not because of the operations themselves, though those are obviously on the list too, because of the political connections. Your father had relationships with 3 state judges, a federal prosecutor, and 2 members of the state legislature. Those relationships created a protection structure that extended beyond organized crime into something more systemic. My father knew those people because he was a businessman," Adrian said. His voice was completely level. "He built legitimate holdings. He also built a system of influence that made certain prosecutions disappear," Elena said, matching his tone. "Not harshly, just directly. I'm not here to argue his character with you. I'm telling you what I was tracking." Adrian looked at the wall for a moment. "You said your mission changed." "In the room, yes. Before the ceremony started. Because of the oath. Because of the way you performed the oath." She paused. "There are men I've watched perform authority for years. Perform it very convincingly. What you did in that room tonight wasn't a performance. And that's relevant to me." "Relevant how?" he said. "Because the task force I work for doesn't only dismantle criminal organizations," she said. "Sometimes it redirects them." The hallway was very quiet. The rain on the roof above them was a continuous sound, steady and impartial. "Redirects," Adrian said slowly, like he was testing the weight of the word. "The political infrastructure your father built isn't going to disappear because he died," Elena said. "The connections are still there, the relationships, the leverage. What changes is how it's used and by whom. If the Castillo organization absorbs the Moretti network, and they will try to, the infrastructure goes to people who are not like you, who don't have whatever it is you have that made you hesitate before punishing instead of acting. The task force has an interest in that not happening." "You're telling me," Adrian said carefully, "that a covert intelligence organization wants to work with a mafia family." "I'm telling you that what I was sent here to do and what I'm considering doing are 2 different things," Elena said. "And I'm not fully sure yet which one I'm going to choose. I'm telling you this because you asked for the actual thing, and this is it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "What were you sent here to do?" She held his gaze. "Dismantle." He absorbed that. His face didn't change dramatically, but something behind his eyes moved, a kind of recalibration, the internal adjustment of someone processing a disclosure that confirms a suspicion they had hoped wouldn't be confirmed. "From the inside," he said. "Yes. 3 weeks. Yes. And my father's death changed the timeline," she said. "I was 6 weeks from having what I needed. Then he died, and the succession ceremony became the pressure point, and I had to decide in real time." "Decide what?" "Whether the intelligence I had built a case on was about the organization as it was, or the organization as it could be, under different leadership." She stopped. The oath made that distinction visible to me in a way it hadn't been before. Adrian stepped back. Not away from her, just back, creating space that he needed to think in. He turned and looked at the closed door at the far end of the hallway for a moment. Then he turned back. The Castillo organization. The two men Bellucci was communicating with. Do you have the communications? Yes. All of them. Everything from the past 8 months. Can you prove it came from Bellucci specifically? Provably. Provably enough for the kind of consequences you're thinking about applying, she said. Yes. Something shifted in the way Adrian was standing. The particular shift that happens when a person moves from managing a crisis to thinking about what comes after it. The political relationships my father had, the judges, the prosecutor, are they compromised in your records? Some are, she said. Some were more transactional than structural. The distinction matters. The ones who were transactional, he said, are they salvageable as legitimate relationships? She looked at him. That's a very specific question. I'm asking it specifically. Elena was quiet for a moment. She was running the calculus in real time, the way she always ran it, all the variables, the operational risk, the intelligence value, the unknowns that remained unquantified. The difference between this calculation and every previous one was that she was aware of the weight of his father's ring in the way he held his right hand and the grief he was carrying under the composure, and the way the fifth section of the oath had sounded when it came out of him, true in a way that couldn't be manufactured. Yes, she said. Some of them are salvageable. He nodded. Something was forming behind his eyes, the shape of a plan or the outline of one. She recognized the look. She had spent years watching people build plans under pressure, and she knew what the beginning of it looked like. Then here's what I need to know, he said. If I restructure the organization, move away from the operations that create the most exposure. Trafficking enforcement contracts, the things my father kept because they were profitable, and because Bellucci pushed to keep them. If that restructuring is real and documented and provable. Does your task force have an interest in seeing it succeed rather than seeing it fail? Elena looked at him for a full 3 seconds before she answered. That depends on who's driving the restructuring. I'm asking you that question about me, Adrian said. You've been watching me for 3 weeks. Before tonight you had a picture of me. After tonight you have a different one. I'm asking you to tell me what that picture is. Elena thought about the easiest answer and the honest one. She chose the honest one because she had come this far tonight by choosing it. 3 weeks ago, the picture I had of you was of someone idealistic about a situation that doesn't reward idealism. Someone who wanted to change something that doesn't change. Someone who was going to either be changed by the organization or removed by it, and my money was on the latter. She paused. Tonight changed that picture. How? Because idealism I've seen fail in rooms like the one behind that door, she said, gesturing toward the ceremony chamber. What you did in there wasn't idealism. It was something harder than that. It was clarity, and clarity survives things that idealism doesn't. Adrian was quiet for a moment. Then his phone vibrated in his pocket. He looked at it, and what Elena saw cross his face in the fraction of a second before he controlled his expression was the particular form of alarm that arrives when something has gone wrong that you didn't know was possible. What is it? She said. He turned the phone toward her. The message on the screen was from a number she didn't recognize. 6 words. Nothing else. She read it and felt the shift happen in her chest. The cold, specific shift of an operation encountering a variable that changes everything. The message said, "We know she's still in there." Elena looked up from the phone. How many people outside this building know you're here tonight? The right people. Controlled list. Controlled by who? His jaw tightened. Caruso. And Caruso's been with the family since before you were born, she said. So we're not questioning Caruso. Who else had access to the guest list? The ceremony arrangements. Adrian looked at the closed door, back at her. His voice was completely flat when he said it. Bellucci coordinated the ceremony logistics. She stared at him. He planned the ceremony, Adrian said. He insisted on it. He said it was his responsibility as my father's oldest advisor to ensure the ceremony was properly arranged. Elena's mind moved fast. Bellucci had arranged the ceremony. Bellucci had controlled who knew about tonight, who was invited, who was excluded, which meant Bellucci had also controlled who knew about the location, the timing, and potentially who was inside the building, which meant the gun he'd pulled wasn't necessarily the whole plan. It was possibly only the piece he controlled personally, the piece designed to activate if the other pieces failed. "Does this building have secondary exits?" she said. "Yes." "How many people know them?" "Caruso, 2 of the senior bodyguards. Get them, now." She was already moving back toward the ceremony chamber door. "We need to relocate everyone, immediately. This building is not secure." "Elena." He caught her arm, not hard, just enough to make her turn. His eyes were direct and steady, and asking a question that he hadn't put into words yet. She answered it anyway. "Yes," she said. "Whatever is coming through those doors, I'm on your side of it." He held her gaze for one more second. Then he pushed the door open, and they moved back into the room together. And his voice was already carrying, as he crossed the threshold, authoritative and completely clear, the voice of a man who has made a decision and is not revisiting it. "On your feet," he said. "All of you. We're moving, right now." The room responded instantly. That was the first real confirmation, more than the oath, and more than the aftermath of the shooting, that something had changed in the 11 men who had sat around that table tonight. They moved without argument, and without the jostling for position that had characterized the earlier hours of the evening. They moved like a unit, like people who had remembered, or perhaps for some of them, discovered for the first time, what it felt like to follow someone worth following. Caruso was already at Adrian's shoulder. "How many?" "Unknown," Adrian said. "Assume enough." "Roots. You pick. You know this building better than anyone." Caruso nodded and moved to the front of the group with the efficiency of a man who had planned for contingencies as a professional practice for 30 years. 2 bodyguards flanked the group's perimeter. Vitelli, despite his size, moved with surprising quiet. Greco stayed close to the back without being asked, covering the rear with the instinctive positioning of someone who understood how exits work. Ferris fell into step beside Elena. He looked at her without speaking for a moment. Then, the message on the phone. "You saw it," she said. "Over his shoulder." "Yes." "Then you know." "I know Bellucci planned further ahead than any of us gave him credit for," Ferris said. "Which means whoever's coming has been watching this building long enough to know you're still inside it." "Yes." "Which means they also know the oath was completed." Elena looked at him. "Probably. And they're coming anyway," Ferris said. "So either they don't care that Adrian is the confirmed head, or they've decided that tonight is still their best window, before he's established, before the network has reorganized itself around him." "The second one," Elena said. Ferris was quiet for a beat. "Then we need to get him out of this building, and we need it to be quiet, and we need it to happen in the next 3 minutes. "That," Elena said, already moving, "is exactly right." The group moved through the back corridor of the building in a tight formation, 12 people plus bodyguards. The sound of their movement absorbed by the continuous rain on the roof above. Bellucci had been left secured in the chamber. That was a decision made in 5 words between Adrian and Caruso, and Elena had not objected to it, and the rest of the room had understood it without requiring explanation. As they reached the secondary stairwell at the back of the building, Elena heard it, downstairs, below them. A sound that was not rain, and not the building settling, and not any of the ambient sounds of the night. A sound with intention behind it. She grabbed Adrian's arm before he reached the stairwell door. "Not that way," she said. He looked at her. "They're already inside," she said. The stairwell door opened before anyone could react further, and everything that had been building all night toward its final shape arrived at once. The man who came through the stairwell door was alone. That was the first thing that didn't fit, and Elena's mind registered it before the rest of the group had fully processed that the door had opened at all. A tactical entry doesn't send one man through a door first, unless that man is either the most expendable or the most confident. This man's posture suggested the latter. He was in his 50s, thick through the shoulders, wearing a dark jacket that wasn't expensive enough for this building, but was practical enough for what he'd come to do. He held his hands slightly away from his body. The specific position of a person who wants to be seen as not immediately threatening, which was itself a kind of threat. He looked at Adrian. "Mr. Moretti," he said. His accent was Gulf Coast, the flat vowels of someone raised along the Louisiana-Texas border. "My name is Reyes. I work for the Castillo organization. I was asked to come here tonight and deliver a message in person." The group had frozen in the corridor. Caruso had his hand inside his jacket. Two bodyguards had moved to flank Adrian without being instructed to do so. Ferris was perfectly still 3 feet to Elena's right. "A message," Adrian said. His voice was flat. "You walked into my building at 2 in the morning to deliver a message." "Your building's security is cooperating with us," Reyes said, "which is information you'll want to have. 2 of the men on your perimeter tonight were on Belushi's payroll. They've been on it for 7 months. Nobody moved. "I'm telling you that," Reyes said, "because the message I'm delivering doesn't come from a position of hostility. It comes from a position of practicality." "Say the message," Adrian said. Reyes reached slowly into his jacket pocket, 2 fingers telegraphing the movement, and produced a folded piece of paper. He held it out. When nobody moved to take it, he set it on the floor and stepped back. Caruso picked it up, unfolded it, scanned it, and handed it to Adrian without expression. Adrian read it. His face gave nothing away. He read it twice, then folded it and put it in his own pocket. "How long does your organization give me to respond?" 48 hours, Reyes said. "Mr. Castillo is a patient man. He's also a realistic one. He knows the oath was completed tonight. He knows what that means for the structure of things going forward. The offer is a reflection of that understanding, not a contradiction of it." "Tell Mr. Castillo I'll be in touch," Adrian said. Reyes nodded. He looked around the group, once his eyes moving professionally cataloging faces. When they reached Elena, they stopped for exactly half a second longer than they stopped on anyone else. Then he turned and went back through the stairwell door. The corridor was silent for 3 full seconds after the door closed. Then Vitelli said at considerable volume, "What did it say?" Adrian looked at the folded paper in his pocket, rather than at Vitelli. "It said the Castillo organization is prepared to recognize the Moretti succession as legitimate in exchange for a territorial conversation. They want a meeting." "That's not the worst thing that could have come through that door," Greco said. "It's not a good thing either," Ferris said. "A territorial conversation with the Castillo organization is not a conversation. It's a negotiation with the outcome already decided. They come to the table knowing what they want, and they don't leave without it." "Then we come knowing what we're not giving," Adrian said. Elena had been watching the stairwell door since Reyes walked back through it. The 2 compromised perimeter guards were a problem that needed solving before the group dispersed tonight. She turned to Caruso. "The 2 men on the perimeter who were on Belushi's payroll. Do you know who they are?" Caruso looked at her with the measured assessment he had been directing at her all night. He had not warmed to her exactly, but he had stopped looking at her with the specific wariness he'd had during the ceremony. "I have 3 candidates," he said. "I've been watching the rotation patterns for the past month. There were irregularities." "Pull them in," Adrian said, quietly. "Separate rooms. Don't tell them why." Caruso moved immediately. The group began to reallocate itself the organic dispersion of people who had been held in close proximity by crisis and were now adjusting to the slightly looser structure of aftermath. Vitelli found a chair and sat in it heavily, the exhaustion of a large man who had been running on adrenaline for several hours suddenly visible. Greco stood by the wall with his arms crossed and his eyes moving. The younger capos clustered near the end of the corridor, speaking in low voices. Ferris fell into step beside Elena again. He had a quality she had noticed in very few people, the ability to position himself near information without appearing to pursue it. "The 2 guards," he said quietly. "If Belushi had them on payroll for 7 months, they may know things we haven't thought to ask about yet." That's why we're pulling them separately, Elena said. People tell different versions when they can't coordinate. You've done this before, he said. Many times. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the Castillo meeting. Adrian's going to take it. Probably. Are you going to be in the room when it happens? Elena looked at him. Why are you asking me that? Because whoever is in that room with him matters a great deal, Ferris said. The Castillo organization doesn't make offers out of goodwill. They make offers when they believe they can control the outcome. If they're offering a territorial conversation instead of a direct move against the organization, it means they're calculating that they can get what they want through leverage rather than force. He paused. Which means they have leverage, and I'd like to know what it is before we walk into a room with them. So would I, Elena said. Ferris looked at her for a long beat. You have resources I don't have access to. Yes. You could find out. Possibly. In 48 hours. Elena looked at him. The thing about Ferris that kept recalibrating her assessment of him was the way he connected conclusions without announcing the connections. He arrived at the right place by steps that other people in this organization would have missed entirely. You're not what I expected you to be, she said. Neither are you, he said, but here we both are. Adrian found her 10 minutes later. The corridor had thinned out as people moved to handle the various operational necessities that the night had generated, and he came to her with the directness that she had come to recognize as characteristic. He didn't build toward things. He arrived at them. The message from Castillo, he said. He pulled the folded paper from his pocket and held it out. This time, it was an offering, not a disclosure. He was choosing to give it to her. She took it. Read it. It was longer than she had expected, 3 paragraphs in precise formal language that had clearly been drafted by someone with legal training. The territorial conversation it proposed was framed as a mutual benefit arrangement. The language around what the Moretti organization would be expected to contribute was carefully indirect. The language around what the Castillo organization would provide in return was considerably more specific. They're offering protection, she said. From what? From themselves primarily, she said. That's how this kind of offer works. The implied threat is always the thing they don't say. She handed the paper back. They're also offering something else. The second paragraph. Read it again. Adrian read it. She watched his eyes move across the text and stop at the same place hers had. They're offering information, he said, about the political relationships, specifically about who in the network was already shifting their allegiance to Castillo before your father died, Elena said. They're telling you they have a list. They're offering to sell it to you. Or they're offering to not use it against me, Adrian said. Both, Elena said. Simultaneously. That's the elegance of it. Adrian refolded the paper. His jaw was tight, the controlled tension of someone managing anger, because the situation doesn't permit expressing it fully. My father's network. People who were in it for years. And Castillo is sitting on the names. Your father may not have known, Elena said. Bellucci managed most of the relationship structure. He would have been positioned to facilitate those shifts without Salvatore being aware. 14 months, Adrian said. Almost to himself. The same thing Ferris had said in the ceremony room, and with the same weight behind it. He was building this for 14 months. Probably longer, Elena said. The communications I accessed were from the past 8 months. The planning likely predates them. Adrian was quiet. The particular silence of someone making a decision that they already know the shape of and are simply giving themselves the space to confirm it. I need everything you have, he said. The communications, the names, whatever your task force assembled on the Moretti network, and the Castillo organization, and the political infrastructure, all of it. That information is classified, Elena said. I know. Sharing it with you would be a significant departure from my operational mandate. I know that too, he said. He looked at her directly. Is it a departure you're willing to make? Elena looked at him. The honest answer was that she had been moving toward this decision since the moment she had told him the truth in the hallway. Maybe since the moment she had pushed the marble table and shouted his name and chosen his survival over her cover. Maybe since the 5th section of the oath, when she had stood at the edge of the room and felt something shift in her professional distance that she had spent years learning not to let shift. Yes, she said, with conditions. Name them. The information doesn't leave your hands. It doesn't get distributed inside the organization beyond the people in this building who already know I exist. And when we go into the Castillo meeting, I'm in the room. Adrian looked at her for a moment. As what? As whoever you need me to be, she said. Legal counsel, advisor, your choice. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile, but was in the territory adjacent to one. You said your mission changed. It did. What does the new mission look like? Elena thought about how to answer that accurately. It looks like making sure that what happens to this organization over the next 6 months doesn't make things worse than they already are. For the people inside it. For the people outside it who are affected by it. She paused. And it looks like making sure you survive long enough to do what you're clearly going to try to do. Which is, change something that doesn't usually change, she said. He was quiet for a moment. You said earlier that clarity survives things idealism doesn't. I did. Do you believe that? I've seen it happen once, she said. In 11 years of doing this work, I've seen it happen once. A man in a situation not unlike yours who was clear enough about what he wanted to build that the people around him eventually built it with him. What happened to him? Elena was quiet for a beat. He made it. It took 4 years and it cost him things he didn't expect to pay. But he made it. Adrian absorbed this. And the people around him. Most of them, she said. Not all. She didn't say not all because it wasn't necessary, and because he was already carrying enough weight tonight without adding the actuarial reality of what the next 4 years might look like. Caruso appeared at the end of the corridor and gave Adrian a look that carried specific information in its brevity. Adrian read it immediately. The guards. Both of them confirmed, Caruso said. He had arrived at Elena's side as naturally as if he had always placed her in the inner ring of the conversation, which she noted as a significant shift from where he had positioned her at the start of the night. The one named Pruitt has been reporting directly to a contact inside Castillo's operation. The other one, Torres, was more peripheral. He passed location information, arrival times. He may not have fully understood what he was part of. There's a difference between those two things, Adrian said. A significant one, Elena said. Adrian looked at Caruso. Pruitt stays contained. We'll deal with him properly, meaning legally with documentation, when we've had time to think about it correctly. He paused on the word legally, in a way that suggested it was deliberate. Torres, talk to him, really talk to him. Find out what he understood and what he didn't. If he was used rather than complicit, that's a different conversation. Caruso absorbed this. Elena watched him absorb it. Watched the very small recalibration that happened in his expression, the adjustment of a man who had served one kind of boss for 30 years and was encountering the first evidence of what serving a different kind would feel like. He didn't comment on it. He simply nodded and moved to execute it. That was when Greco came around the corner from the direction of the ceremony chamber, and his face had a quality Elena had not seen on it all night. Not anger. Not the managed competence he had been projecting since the shooting. Something rawer than either of those. You need to come back to the room, he said to Adrian. What happened? Bellucci wants to talk, Greco said. And before you say no, you need to hear what he's saying. He has to tell you. The three of them moved back to the ceremony chamber. The room had been partially restored to order. The table was upright again. The candles replaced, though the atmosphere of the space had changed so completely from the formality of the ceremony that the physical tidying felt almost beside the point. Bellucci was still in the chair against the wall. The restraints on his wrists had not been removed. His jacket was torn at the shoulder from when he had been tackled, and his white shirt had a smear of something on the collar dust or plaster from the gunshot, and he looked for the first time in Elena's observation of him like exactly what he was tonight, an old man at the end of something he had built over a lifetime. He looked at Adrian when Adrian came into the room. Not at Elena, not at Greco, at Adrian. And what was in his eyes was not the coldness that had been there during the ceremony, and not the controlled fury of a man caught in a failed plan. It was something older and less defended than either of those. "I'm going to tell you something," Bellucci said, "and I need you to listen to it as your father's oldest friend, not as my captor." "I'll listen to it," Adrian said. "That's all I'm promising." Bellucci's chest moved with a breath that was not quite steady. "Your father knew about the Castillo approach, about the overtures they were making to reshape the organizational territory. He knew for 6 months before he died." The room was completely still. "He didn't know I was involved," Bellucci continued. "He thought I was managing it, keeping them at distance. What he told me in private was that he didn't want you inheriting a war. He said the organization had to evolve or it would consume itself, and he said he had been wrong to build it the way he built it, and he wanted you to have something that could be different." His voice was steady, but barely. "He trusted me to protect that transition, to buy time, to make it safe for you to be the kind of boss he wanted you to be." He stopped. "I told him I would." Adrian stood very still. "What changed?" Elena said. Her voice was quiet but direct. She asked it because Adrian was not going to be able to ask it yet, and the answer mattered. Bellucci looked at her. The look of a man deciding whether to resent the question or respect it. He chose to answer it. "I believed it for a year," he said. "I believed in the transition. I started the conversations with Castillo in good faith. Territorial adjustment, shared structure, less violence. It was what Salvatore wanted." He exhaled slowly. "Then I watched the numbers, the revenue that the old operations generated, the protection income, the enforcement contracts, and I watched what happened to organizations that tried to reduce those things, and what happened to the people who ran them. And I decided that what Salvatore wanted was going to get you killed. That being the kind of boss he wanted you to be in this environment was not an aspiration, it was a death sentence." "So you decided to remove me," Adrian said. His voice had no heat in it. That was the most striking thing about it. No heat, no tremor, just the flat, precise quality of a man receiving information and integrating it. "I decided to install someone who could survive," Bellucci said. "Not because I wanted the organization for myself. I'm 71 years old. I don't want the organization. I wanted it to exist after I was gone. I wanted 32 years of work to mean something." He looked at his bound wrists. "I was wrong. About what you are. About what you're capable of. I saw your father in you, and I thought I knew what that meant. I didn't." The room was quiet for a long time. Then Vitelli from across the room said something that Elena did not expect. "He's not wrong about the death sentence part." Every head turned. Vitelli looked uncomfortable being the focus of the room's attention, but continued anyway. "I've been in this organization for 22 years. I've watched 3 bosses who tried to de-escalate the operational model. 2 of them didn't survive the attempt. 1 did, but only because he was already dying of cancer, and no one thought it was worth the effort." He looked at Adrian. "I'm not saying Bellucci was right to do what he did. I'm saying the concern underneath it isn't manufactured. The concern is real." "The concern is real," Adrian said. "The method was wrong. Those are different things." He looked at Bellucci for a long moment. "You had my father's confidence for 32 years. You knew him better than almost anyone, and you decided that what he wanted was wrong." "I decided it would kill you," Bellucci said. "Maybe," Adrian said. "But that's my risk to decide to take, not yours." Bellucci closed his eyes briefly, the gesture of a man who has followed the logic of his own argument to its end and found it insufficient. "Yes," he said, "that's true. Elena watched this exchange with the complete attention she reserved for moments that were genuinely rare. She had been in rooms where powerful men confronted each other before. She had watched negotiations and accusations, and the particular choreography of men competing for dominance or survival. This was something different. This was two men looking directly at the cost of a miscalculation, one in its consequences, and one in its origin, and neither of them looking away from it. "I'm not going to have you killed," Adrian said. "That's not what this is." Belushi opened his eyes. "You're going to tell Caruso everything," Adrian continued. "Every communication with Castillo, every name you gave them, every piece of information about this organization that went to them through you, every person on this side who was shifted or influenced by your arrangement. All of it." He paused. "And then, you're going to leave New Orleans. Permanently. Whatever you've built here, whatever you own, whatever relationships you have in this city, you walk away from them. You go somewhere quiet and you live out whatever time you have left." "That's exile," Belushi said. "Yes," Adrian said. "It is. You could have chosen something worse." "I know," Adrian said. "I chose this." Belushi looked at him for a long moment. Something in his face shifted through several things in rapid succession, and on the other side of all of them, something that might have been in a different context relief. "Your father would have chosen something worse," he said. "My father is dead," Adrian said. "This is my organization now." Those words landed in the room with a finality that was physical. Elena felt it. She watched it move across the faces of every man present. The capos, the bodyguards, Caruso, who had come back into the room silently during the exchange, Ferris, who had positioned himself near the door. What she was watching was not a declaration of authority. She had seen plenty of those. What she was watching was the moment an authority becomes real, not because it was claimed, but because the people in the room recognized something in the person claiming it that they hadn't been sure was there and now were. Greco uncrossed his arms. That small, that specific. The body releasing a defensiveness it had been carrying all night. Vitelli from his chair gave a single nod that was not performative and not subordinate. It was the nod of a man acknowledging something he has decided to trust. Ferris looked at Elena from across the room. She held his gaze. He gave her a look that said, "Do you see what I see?" She gave him one back that said yes. Elena's phone vibrated in her pocket. She looked at it, stepping slightly away from the group as she did. The number on the screen was one she recognized with a drop in her stomach that she kept off her face through long practice. It was a number she hadn't seen active in several months. A number that meant the conversation she'd been avoiding having with the task force was no longer avoidable. She stepped into the doorway and answered, "Vale." The voice on the other end was her direct supervisor, a man named Harwick, who ran the task force's Gulf operations from an office in Washington, and who communicated with her through secondary channels under normal circumstances. The fact that he was calling her primary number at 2:30 in the morning meant normal circumstances had been suspended. "We have a situation." "I'm aware," she said, keeping her voice low. "Are you inside the building?" "Yes. The operation has been escalated," Harwick said. "We have new intelligence that changes the priority structure. The Castillo organization's political penetration goes further than we previously mapped. There's a federal appointment in play. A judicial appointment. If Castillo consolidates the Moretti network on top of their existing structure, they will have enough political leverage to influence a federal judgeship." A pause. "Vale, this is no longer a regional organized crime matter. This is a national security issue." Elena stood in the doorway and looked back into the room. At Adrian, who was speaking quietly with Caruso. At the 11 men who had been through something tonight that had changed the organizational temperature in a way she hadn't predicted. At the parchment still sitting on the surface where Adrian had left it after the oath. "What's the directive?" she said. "We need the Moretti network neutralized," Harwick said. "The original mission parameters are reinstated. Whatever you've built in that room tonight, Val, it can't be the play. The Castillo organization absorbing them is the worst outcome. But the Moretti organization surviving intact is the second worst. That's not the only other option, she said. Silence on the other end. What are you telling me? I'm telling you there's a third option, she said. Give me 48 hours. To do what? To present it to you properly, she said. 48 hours, Harwick. If it doesn't work, we do it your way. The silence stretched long enough that she began to calculate what she would do if he said no. Then, 48 hours, not a minute more. And Vale, whatever you're building in there, be certain about it. Because if this falls apart, it falls on you. He ended the call. Elena put the phone in her pocket and stood for a moment in the doorway, 1 foot in the room and 1 foot in the hallway. And she understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has just moved past the last available exit, that she was committed now in a way she hadn't been 48 hours ago, or 3 weeks ago, or at any point in the past 11 years of doing this work. She was committed to a man she had met 4 hours ago. She was committed to the possibility that something different could happen in a situation where different things almost never happened. She was committed to 48 hours that would either change everything or cost her the career she had spent her adult life building. She stepped back into the room. Adrian looked up. He read something in her face. Not all of it, not the Harwick call, not the directive that had just been reinstated and that she had just purchased 48 hours of suspension for, but something. He read enough. Good news or bad news, he said. Both, she said. Depending on what you do next. He looked at her steadily. In the hours since she had told a room full of dangerous men that they were reading an ancient document completely wrong, she had watched this man absorb more than most people absorb in a year. She had watched him perform a ceremony that revealed a traitor, survive an assassination attempt, complete an oath while chaos erupted around him, exile a man who had served his father for 3 decades, and absorb intelligence that restructured his understanding of his own inheritance. He had done all of it without fracturing. Tell me, he said. She told him. Not everything. Not the Harwick call, not the 48-hour window, not the federal appointment, or the national security escalation. Those were pieces she needed to position carefully before she gave them to him. What she told him was the shape of what was coming. The Castillo meeting. The intelligence she could put into his hands before it. The third option she had described to Harwick in the broadest terms because she hadn't fully assembled it yet. She told him she needed something from him in return. What? He said. I need you to decide something tonight, she said. Right now in this room in front of these men. Not because I'm asking you to perform it for them. Because I need to know it's real before I put everything I have behind it. What decision? The operations that generate the most exposure, she said. The trafficking, the enforcement contracts, the things Belushi insisted on keeping. I need to know if you're willing to eliminate them. Completely, not reduce. Eliminate. The room had gone quiet. The men who were left had heard her. She had not tried to keep it from them. This was not a private negotiation. This was something that needed to happen in front of witnesses, because what she was about to do on behalf of this organization required her to believe that the organization was what she was staking her career on, and the only way to believe that was to watch him say it in public. Adrian looked around the room, at each face. Vitelli, Greco, Ferris, Caruso, the men who remained. Yes, he said. She held his gaze. Say it clearly. The trafficking operations end, Adrian said. His voice carried the room. The enforcement contracts are terminated. The revenue we lose from those is revenue we rebuild through the legitimate holdings over the next 2 years. Anyone who can't operate inside that structure leaves the organization. Anyone who tries to operate outside it answers to me directly. He paused. That's what this organization is from tonight forward. If any of you can't work inside it, tell me now and we settle it cleanly. Nobody spoke. Vitelli, after a long moment, said, I can work inside it. Greco nodded. Ferris said nothing, which from him was the equivalent of a declaration. Caruso looked at Adrian with an expression that contained 30 years of service, and the specific form of pride that a man feels when someone he has watched grow up becomes something worth the watching. Elena took a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. 48 hours. A third option she was still assembling. A career that was now tied to whether a 34-year-old man with his dead father's ring on his hand could do something that almost never got done. Outside, the rain had not stopped. New Orleans continued its indifferent life below the windows of the St. Verona Club, the city that had seen every kind of human arrangement and survived most of them. Elena picked up her phone and began making the first of the calls that the next 48 hours required. The third option had to be real before morning. The first call Elena made was to a number she had memorized and never stored in any device. It rang 4 times before a woman answered. No greeting, just silence that indicated readiness. Elena spoke in under 60 seconds, gave 3 pieces of information, and asked for one thing in return. The woman on the other end said she would need 2 hours. Elena said she had 46. The woman said that would be sufficient and ended the call. The second call was harder. It was to a man named Doyle, who ran intelligence operations out of a regional office that officially handled financial crimes and unofficially handled the kind of cases that financial crime labels got applied to when the actual nature of the work was too complicated to describe in a budget report. Doyle had been Elena's first supervisor when she joined the task force 11 years ago. He was the only person in the organization she trusted without reservation, and the only person whose disapproval she would have found genuinely difficult to withstand. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he had been awake, which meant he already knew something. "Tell me you haven't done what it sounds like you've done," he said. "I need you to listen before you react," Elena said. "That's not a reassuring opening." "The Castillo organization has sufficient political leverage to influence a federal judicial appointment," she said. "Harwick briefed me 20 minutes ago. That's the escalation." "I know," Doyle said. "I was in the briefing that produced Harwick's briefing, which is why I've been sitting here waiting for your call." Elena stopped. "You knew he was going to reinstate the original directive." "I knew he was going to try," Doyle said. "I also know you well enough to know you'd already built something in that room that the original directive can't accommodate. So talk to me. What do you have?" She told him. All of it this time. The oath, the Belushi exposure, the exile, the declaration Adrian had made in front of his capos about eliminating the high-exposure operations. The third option she had sketched for Harwick and was still assembling. The 48-hour window. All of it. Doyle was quiet for a moment after she finished. "You're asking me to help you make the case that a criminal organization voluntarily restructuring itself under new leadership is more valuable to national security than dismantling it. I'm asking you to help me make the case that the alternative to that is the Castillo organization absorbing the Moretti political infrastructure and controlling a federal judgeship," Elena said, "which is the actual choice on the table." "Harwick sees a third option," Doyle said. "Full dismantlement. Castillo gets nothing because there's nothing left to get." "Full dismantlement takes 18 months minimum," Elena said. "The judicial appointment is in 11 weeks. Castillo doesn't need the Moretti network fully operational. They need the political relationships. Those relationships exist independently of whether the organization is standing. The only way to neutralize them in 11 weeks is to put someone in control of them who has a reason to use them differently." Another silence. Longer this time. Elena recognized the quality of it. It was the silence of a man working the logic from multiple angles because he is looking for the flaw and not finding it. "The man," Doyle said finally. "Adrian Moretti, you're certain." "I watched him perform the succession oath of a 300-year-old criminal organization and make it sound like a personal covenant," Elena said. "Then I watched him exile a man who had served his family for 32 years instead of having him killed. Then I watched him stand in front of 11 capos and declare the elimination of the most profitable operations in the network because he decided it was the right thing to do." She paused. "Doyle, I've been doing this for 11 years. I know what I'm looking at." The silence that followed was the longest of the call. "I'll make 3 calls," Doyle said. That's what I can do in 46 hours. 3 calls to the right people. Whether it's enough depends on things neither of us can control. 3 calls from you is more than enough, Elena said. Elena. His voice shifted. Not professionally, personally. The way it shifted when he was about to say something he would not say in a formal context. Be careful. Not operationally. I mean the other kind. She understood what he meant. She had understood it before he said it. I know, she said. You've never gotten personally invested before. I know that too. It changes how you see things. Maybe that's not always wrong, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Maybe not, he said. Make it work, Val. I'll hold Harwick for 46 hours, not 47. He ended the call. Elena stood in the hallway outside the ceremony chamber and put the phone in her pocket and stood still for a moment, with her eyes closed. Not from exhaustion, though exhaustion was present, but from the specific practice of composure that she had learned early in this work. You take 10 seconds before you go back into the room. You put everything that's personal on a shelf that you can reach later. You walk in as the version of yourself that the situation requires. She opened her eyes and went back in. Adrian was at the table. He had the parchment in front of him again, not studying it, just looking at it the way you look at something that has changed the shape of your evening and possibly your life. Caruso was beside him. The rest of the room had thinned to Ferris Greco, and 2 bodyguards stationed near the door. Vitelli had gone to begin contacting the parish operations, the practical machinery of the organization that didn't stop moving because of what had happened in this room tonight. The younger capos had been sent to handle the perimeter, the legitimate version of it, the 2 compromised guards replaced, and the external security reset. Things were moving. The organization was absorbing the night and adjusting to it the way living things adjust to disruption through motion, through the continuation of function. Adrian looked up when Elena came in. Good calls or bad calls, he said. The same question he'd asked before. Useful calls, she said. We have 46 hours before the external pressure makes the Castillo meeting non-optional. What's the external pressure? She told him about the federal judicial appointment. Told it plainly without softening the strategic reality of what it meant. Watched him absorb it the way he had absorbed everything tonight completely and without performance. They want the judgeship to protect operations, he said. Not politics. They don't care about judicial philosophy. They want someone on the federal bench who will manage outcomes in specific cases. Correct. Cases involving trafficking, he said. Enforcement. The exact operations I just declared eliminated from this organization. Yes, Elena said. He looked at the parchment for a moment. So by eliminating those operations, I also eliminate my value to Castillo as a partner, which makes you a target instead of a resource, Elena said. Yes, that's the calculation. But it also eliminates the leverage the political relationships represent, he said. If those operations don't exist, the people who provided political cover for them have nothing to cover. The relationship becomes transactional in a different direction. Elena looked at him. That's exactly right. I worked in real estate for 6 years, he said. I understand how leverage changes when the underlying asset changes. He looked at Caruso, the 3 judges, the federal prosecutor, the 2 legislators. I need to know which ones were protecting specific operations and which ones were protecting the family name broadly. Caruso said Bellucci managed those relationships. Bellucci is currently telling you everything he knows. Adrian said. Start there. Caruso moved. Ferris, from his position near the wall, said, There's something you're not saying. He had directed it at Elena. He did it without aggression, with the same calm precision he applied to everything, and Elena recognized that continuing to underestimate Declan Ferris was a mistake she could not afford. The task force I work for has 46 hours to decide whether to support a third option or reinstate the original directive, she said. She said it in the open to the room because Ferris had earned the directness and because Adrian needed to hear it in full rather than in pieces. The original directive was dismantlement. The third option is using this organization's political relationships to block the Castillo judicial appointment and restructure the Moretti network simultaneously. She paused. If the task force says no, I lose the institutional support. We're on our own. Adrian looked at her. And if we're on our own, then we do it anyway, she said. It just gets harder. Something shifted in his expression. A specific quality she had not seen on his face before tonight, and that she recognized because she had seen it on very few faces in her career. It was not surprise. It was not relief. It was the particular recognition that passes between people when they realize they are operating on the same terms, the same willingness, the same unwillingness to stop at the edge of what is safe. Okay, he said, simply, like it settled something. Greco cleared his throat from across the room. He had been listening with the focused attention of a man who had spent his career operating in conditions of managed uncertainty and who had developed a finely calibrated sense for when a situation was salvageable and when it was not. The Castillo meeting, he said. In 48 hours. Who goes? Adrian, Elena said. Ferris. Me. Not Caruso, Greco said. Caruso is more valuable here, Elena said. Managing what comes out of Bellucci's debrief, keeping the operational continuity stable. We need the building to be standing when we get back. Greco nodded slowly. Then, I want to ask you something, directly. Ask it, Elena said. After this is over, he said, whatever over looks like, what happens to this organization in your task force's assessment? Because what I've heard tonight sounds like you're positioning us as an asset. And assets get used, and then they get discarded when the use is finished. It was the most important question in the room. Elena knew it, and Greco knew she knew it. And the silence that preceded her answer was not the silence of someone formulating a diplomatic response. It was the silence of someone deciding whether to give the honest one. That depends on what this organization is in 6 months, she said. If it's what Adrian declared tonight, if the high-exposure operations are actually gone, and the restructuring is real and documented and verifiable, my assessment will reflect that. My assessment carries weight with the people who make those decisions. She looked at Adrian. I won't promise outcomes I can't control. What I can promise is that my assessment will be accurate. If you are what you say you are, I'll say so. Greco looked at her for a long moment, then at Adrian. Something passed between the two men that Elena didn't have the context to fully read, some reference to shared history, some shorthand built over years. Good enough, Greco said. It was 4 in the morning when Bellucci's debrief produced the piece of information that changed everything. Caruso brought it to Adrian in 3 sentences. Elena was standing close enough to hear it. When she did, she felt the cold, specific drop of a variable arriving that restructured the entire calculation. One of the 3 judges, the one with the deepest operational protection relationship, was not a Moretti asset, had not been for 14 months. Bellucci had shifted him, quietly. The judge was already inside the Castillo infrastructure, which meant Castillo already had a sitting federal district judge before the appointment they were pursuing, which meant the judicial appointment was not their first move. It was their consolidation move. They're further along than we thought, Ferris said. He had processed it in about 4 seconds. The appointment isn't the goal, it's the capstone. Which means the 48-hour window isn't actually 48 hours, Elena said. She was already reaching for her phone. If the district judge is already turned, Castillo can initiate protection for the appointment process immediately. The window is whatever it takes them to realize Bellucci's silence means the meeting tonight failed. How long? Adrian said. They sent Reyes here at 2 in the morning, Elena said. They're already operating on a compressed timeline. They may already know. She looked at him directly. The Castillo meeting can't be in 48 hours. It has to be today. The room absorbed this. Today, Greco said. It's 4 in the morning. We request the meeting for this afternoon, Elena said. We use the urgency as signal. It tells them we know more than they expected us to know, and that we're moving faster than their timeline assumed. It changes the power dynamic before we walk in the door. Adrian looked at Ferris. "Can you reach their people before 6? Ferris pulled out his own phone. "I have a number Reyes left. He expected 48 hours. Calling at 6 in the morning will make a statement." "Make it," Adrian said. Ferris stepped away and made the call. What happened in the next 4 hours was not dramatic. It was operational. The kind of dense, detailed, exhausting work that produces dramatic outcomes but has no drama in itself. Elena made 2 more calls and received information from the woman she had called first, who had come through with everything requested in the time promised. Caruso conducted the full Bellucci debrief and produced a document that Elena reviewed and Ferris annotated from his knowledge of the Castillo organizational structure. Adrian read every page of it without rushing and asked questions that were specific and operational and occasionally surprised her with their precision. At 6:15, Ferris came back into the room. 2 o'clock this afternoon, he said. Private location. They'll send the address at noon. They agreed immediately, Adrian said. Immediately, Ferris confirmed. Which means they want to know what we know. The urgency worked the way Elena said it would. Adrian looked at Elena. You need to sleep. So do you. I'll sleep when this is over, he said. That's what people say before they make avoidable mistakes, she said. 4 hours, both of us. The building is secure. Caruso has it. He looked at her for a moment. She expected an argument and did not get one. What she got instead was a nod that carried the weight of a man who had been running on something stronger than adrenaline for hours, and who recognized with the practical intelligence that had been on display all night that she was right. 4 hours, he said. She was right about something else she hadn't said out loud. That she would not sleep. Not because she was incapable of it, but because she had 3 hours of intelligence organization to do before the Castillo meeting, and 4 hours was tight enough that sleep was a luxury she could defer. She spent the time constructing what she privately called the package, the full evidentiary picture of the Castillo organization's judicial penetration, the Bellucci communications, the organizational map Ferris had helped annotate, and the third option in its complete form, not the sketch she had given Harwick, but the fully developed argument for why a restructured Moretti organization was the only available instrument for blocking a Castillo consolidation in the time frame the judicial appointment required. At 8 in the morning, she sent it to Doyle. His response came back in 11 minutes. 3 words. I'll make the calls. At 11:58, a text message arrived with an address in the Garden District. Adrian read it, showed it to Elena, and gave it to Caruso, who ran the location through every check available, and came back with the assessment that it was clean, a private residence owned through 3 layers of corporate structure that eventually traced back to a legitimate real estate holding. The kind of location that said, we are being careful, not that we are being threatening. They drove there in 2 vehicles. Adrian and Elena in the first, Ferris in the second with 2 of the bodyguards. Nobody spoke much during the drive. Elena watched the city past the window and thought about the deposition she would have to write afterward, the account of how she had managed this operation and why the decisions she had made deviated from the original mandate and what the outcome had justified. She thought about Harwick's 48 hours and whether Doyle's 3 calls had been enough. She thought about the look on Adrian's face when he had said okay and what it had meant. She stopped thinking about the last one because Doyle had been right about what investment does to perception, and she needed clear perception in the next 2 hours. The man who met them at the door of the Garden District residence was not Reyes, and was not anyone Elena had a face for in her intelligence files. He was calm and polite, and led them through the house to a sitting room where 4 men were already present. She identified 3 of them from file photos. The 4th was the man at the center, and she did not need a file photo because his posture alone announced him. Rodrigo Castillo was 63 years old and had built one of the most structurally sophisticated criminal organizations in the Gulf South over 30 years with the specific methodology of a man who believed that the most durable power was the kind that looked like something else. His organization had fewer violent incidents on record than any comparable network in the region, not because violence was absent, but because it was managed so efficiently that its evidence rarely materialized in ways that produced official attention. He was the kind of man who wore his authority the way expensive clothing is worn by people who have always had money. Naturally. Without effort. Without needing anyone to notice. He looked at Adrian with the frank assessment of one chess player looking at another's opening move. "Mr. Moretti," he said, "you've had quite a night." "I've had quite a morning too," Adrian said. He sat without being invited, to which was a small thing, and also not a small thing. Elena sat beside him. Ferris took a position slightly back, which was correct. Castillo's eyes moved to Elena. They stayed there. "I was told you'd be bringing counsel," he said. "I brought her," Adrian said. "She's more than counsel." "I can see that," Castillo said. He said it without inflection, which was more informative than inflection would have been. He had done his homework on her, or he was very good at appearing to have done his homework, and given his record, the distinction didn't matter much. "I want to have a short conversation," Adrian said. "And then I want to make you an offer." "I'm listening," Castillo said. "You've spent 14 months building an arrangement with Marco Bellucci that was designed to give you a pathway into Moretti organizational structure without a direct conflict," Adrian said. "That arrangement is over. Bellucci is no longer part of this organization, and the pathway he was constructing is closed." He paused. "Let that settle. The judicial appointment you're pursuing through District Judge Arnett. I know Arnett has been inside your structure for 14 months. I know what the appointment is designed to consolidate." The four men on Castillo's side of the room were very still. Castillo himself did not change expression. But Elena, who was watching his hands the way she had watched Bellucci's hands during the oath ceremony, saw his right index finger move. One small tap against the arm of his chair. The tell of a man recalibrating. "That's an interesting set of claims," Castillo said. "They're documented," Adrian said. "Every communication between your organization and Marco Bellucci for the past 8 months. The Arnett connection going back 14. The structural arrangement you built around the appointment timeline." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm not here to threaten you with that documentation. I'm here to offer you something better." Castillo looked at him. "What could you possibly offer me that's better than what I've already built?" "Legitimacy," Adrian said. The word landed in the room with a weight that was disproportionate to its size. "The Moretti political relationships are real," Adrian continued. "They've been real for 30 years. They exist independently of the operations that generated them, and they will continue to exist under different leadership with different operational priorities. What I'm offering is a conversation about shared political interests that doesn't require either of us to expose what we know about the other. What I'm offering is a line that doesn't get crossed." He paused. "The judicial appointment. You want control over federal outcomes in specific case categories. I understand that. What I'm offering is a different kind of influence over those outcomes, one that doesn't require a compromised judge and doesn't create the exposure that a compromised judge eventually creates." "Why?" Castillo studied him for a long moment. "You're proposing to use political relationships to influence federal appointments legitimately. I'm proposing that we both have interest in federal judicial outcomes, and that pursuing those interests through legitimate channels is more durable than the alternative," Adrian said. "Because compromised judges eventually get caught. And when they do, everyone connected to them is standing in the blast radius." Elena watched Castillo work through this. She had helped Adrian build the argument over the preceding hours, and she knew its architecture well enough to know where the stress points were. The stress point was here at the moment when Castillo had to weigh the infrastructure he had already built against the argument that it was more fragile than it appeared. "Judge Arnett," Castillo said finally. "I'll leave Arnett to you," Adrian said. "What happens there is your decision. I'm not offering you what I know as a weapon. I'm offering it as a reason to have a different conversation than the one you came into tonight expecting to have." Castillo looked at Elena directly. "Your intelligence," he said. "I'm counsel," she said. "Your intelligence," he said again, and this time it was not a question. "Which means this conversation has a dimension I wasn't briefed on. It means that the documentation Mr. Moretti referenced has a chain of custody that makes it more durable than what you may be assuming, Elena said. And it means that the legitimate channel Mr. Moretti is proposing has institutional support that makes it more powerful than what you may be assuming. Castillo looked between them for a moment. A long enough that one of his associates shifted in his seat. Then something happened in Castillo's face. Not a concession, not a defeat. Something more like the specific acknowledgement of a man who has encountered a situation that is more complex than anticipated, and who is experienced enough to recognize when complexity is a reason to reconsider rather than to escalate. "I'll need time to consider this," he said. "You have 48 hours, Adrian said. "After that, the conversation we've had today becomes a different kind of document." They left the way they came in. In the car going back, Adrian sat beside Elena and said nothing for several minutes. The city was fully awake now, ordinary New Orleans moving through an ordinary afternoon that had no idea what had been built and dismantled and built again in the hours since midnight. The rain had stopped. The streets were bright with the particular sharp light that follows a long storm. "Doyle called while you were in the meeting," Ferris said from the front seat. He handed his phone back to Elena. She read the message on the screen. 3 calls were enough. "Harwick has been briefed. Third option is approved pending 6-month evaluation. Don't make me regret this, Val." She showed it to Adrian without comment. He read it again. Then handed the phone back to Ferris and looked out the window. "What does the 6-month evaluation look like?" he said. "It looks like what you declared in that room last night," she said. "Documented, verified, real. And you're the evaluator." "One of them," she said. He nodded slowly. "You'll need access to the books, the operational structure, the decisions as they happen." "Yes." He looked at her. "That means you'll need to stay." Elena looked back at him. The city went by the window. She thought about Doyle's warning, and about the shelf where she had put everything personal, and about whether the shelf was still where she had left it. "Yes," she said. "It does." He didn't say anything else for the rest of the drive. He didn't need to. What Elena understood, and what she suspected Adrian understood equally, was that the conversation they were not having in that car was as significant as every conversation they had conducted since the moment she had told a room full of armed men that they were reading an ancient document completely wrong. Some things don't require words when the weight of shared experience is sufficient ballast. Some agreements are made in the space between sentences, in the silence that 2 people allow to exist between them, because filling it would diminish what it contains. 3 days later, Rodrigo Castillo accepted the terms. Not all of them. He negotiated 2 points back and added 1 condition that took another full day to resolve. But he accepted them. The Arnett appointment was withdrawn, quietly attributed to scheduling considerations that nobody in the press pursued with any vigor. The documentation Elena's task force held remained in a sealed file that would stay sealed as long as the terms held. 3 weeks after that, the first of the high-exposure operations was formally dissolved. The enforcement contracts were terminated. The trafficking network that Belushi had insisted on maintaining was dismantled through a process that Caruso managed with the quiet efficiency that defined everything he did, and the people who had been inside it were either absorbed into legitimate operations or released from the organization entirely. 2 of them chose to leave. 3 of them stayed and became, over the following months, some of the most committed advocates for the new structure. The way people sometimes become the strongest adherents to the thing they once opposed when they experience it working. Belushi was in a coastal town in Alabama by the end of the first week. He had left without incident, and without the dramatic gesture that Elena had half expected from a man of his temperament. He had simply gone. Caruso received 1 phone call from him 6 weeks later. He said nothing of consequence. He asked how Adrian was managing. Caruso told him adequately, which was the honest answer, and also more than Belushi had been prepared to hear. He did not call again. Ferris became, with a speed that surprised almost everyone except Elena, the most effective operational mind in the reorganized structure. He had an understanding of legitimate financial architecture that turned out to be directly applicable to what the Moretti holdings needed to become, and he applied it with the same calm precision he applied to everything. Adrian trusted him with the pace of a man who had learned in one very concentrated evening the difference between the kind of people who were worth trusting and the kind who weren't. On the roof of the Saint Verona Club, 41 days after the night of the oath, Adrian and Elena stood in the dark watching New Orleans breathe below them. The city had no knowledge of what had happened in the building beneath their feet or what was continuing to happen because of it. Cities rarely know the specific moments that change their architecture. They only experience the changed architecture later, and by then, the moment is history. "Harwick sent the preliminary evaluation," Elena said. Adrian looked at her. "And?" "Positive," she said, cautiously. "It's Harwick, so cautious is all you're getting for at least another 3 months." "3 months I can work with," he said. She looked out at the city, the lights of it, the unending motion of a place that had survived every kind of human arrangement for 300 years, and intended to survive all the ones that followed. "The parchment," she said. "I've been thinking about the 5th section." "The warning," he said. "The thing it says about trust," she said. "About the man at your right hand. When I first decoded it, I interpreted it as a threat assessment tool, a mechanism for exposing betrayal. And now," he said. "Now I think it's something else," she said. "I think it's a description of what leadership costs. The man who has to sit at the head of a table and know that anyone in the room could betray him, and who chooses to trust them anyway, not blindly, but fully. That's not a warning. That's a definition." Adrian was quiet for a moment. "A definition of what?" "Of exactly the kind of person the oath is designed to confirm," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. The particular look she had seen in the hallway outside the ceremony chamber, the one that said he was not going to be given easy ground and was not asking for it. "You're staying," he said. "Not a question." "I'm staying," she said. The city below them moved through its night with the full indifference of a place that has seen everything and been changed by some of it. The rain that had defined the night of the oath was long finished. The air was warm and heavy in the way of the Gulf South in spring, carrying with it the smell of the river and the flowering trees and the older, deeper smell of a city built on ground that had no business holding this much history and had held it anyway. Some things survive because they are strong enough to withstand everything that tries to destroy them. Some things survive because someone decides at the exact right moment to stand between them and the thing that would end them. And some things survive because a person who came to finish them looked closely enough to see something worth saving instead. The Moretti Empire did not collapse the night Salvatore died. It did not collapse when the oath nearly failed, or when Bellucci reached for the gun, or when Castillo's men came through the building's doors. It did not collapse when the 48-hour window nearly closed, or when the third option was still only a sketch on a piece of paper at 4 a.m. It survived because a man with his dead father's ring on his hand stood at the head of a table and chose clarity over fear, and because a woman who came to bring it down looked at that choice and made one of her own. Some thrones are not taken. Some thrones are earned in the space of a single night by the willingness to be exactly what the moment asks for, nothing more, nothing less, and nothing performed. Adrian Moretti understood that by morning. Elena Vale had always known it. The oath had simply made it visible to everyone else.